I just wanted to quickly say something to people who are, followers of the Serpentine Galleries, but not necessarily as well informed about soil science, which is that you are a world-renowned soil scientist. I'm very lucky that I got the chance to work with you. You're the director of environmental sciences and Institute for Agriculture at the University of Sydney, and you invented a whole field of soil science which relates to investigating it with new technology called pedometrics. I just want to say those things so that people who are listening to us hear them. You don't have to be embarrassed or start to get annoyed that I'm reading out your bio. But I also wanted to start out by reading a poem which you selected for the book Field and Palette, which is a soil science and art kind of compendium that, by the way, was co-edited by Gerd Veselek, who was my soil science guy in Berlin. But anyway, the poem that you selected, one of the poems that you selected for your contribution to that volume, it's by David van der Linden, and it's called Dirt, and it goes like this: dirt, a four-letter word for soil, for life, forever. I love that poem. And of course, dirt is an insult to you soil scientists, isn't that right?
Well, yeah. Well, when I'm teaching, I often say there's only one four-letter word you can't use in this class, and that's the D word. Why do we say that? I think it's got the illusion that it's something unattractive, unlife-giving, and so on. And but we should probably learn to embrace it as a terminology, because for many people they don't mean anything negative by it. They mean they're really talking about the soil, the life-giving soil. So I think it's a bit of snobbery on behalf of soil scientists, and they should learn to embrace the word and call themselves the dirt doctors. That's a terminology that I've heard here being used in Australia in the bush. So people talk about the dirt doctors, the people who come and look at the soil and decide how good it is or what we need to do to it to improve it. So I think it's something to be embraced in the long run.
Yeah. I agree with you, actually, because, since I've been doing this making neosoil and giving it away kind of thing in different places, a lot of people write to me or text me and say, like, oh, I just planted something in your dirt, or I loved your dirt, or what, and I also agree, they don't seem to mean it in such a negative fashion. They may not even be aware that dirt is technically the inorganic material and soil also contains the organic and the living material. So, but you brought up something just now, which I wanted to ask you about, which is you said that in Australia, people refer to soil scientists as dirt doctors. Now, yes. I don't think that other places have terminology for soil scientists, because soil scientists are not that well known in Europe or the US, but I feel that Australia has a closer connection to all these issues around the land and the conservation of the land. And I wanted to ask you if you think that's right, or that's just my impression.
It's a good question. I don't know if I can give you an authoritative answer on that, because I think if you went to the mid-US, you might hear the terminology around dirt doctors or dirt scientists. You might hear that, I think. But Australia has changed, of course. Up until, I would say, 50 years ago, I think the link to the land was very strong. The link to the whole continent was very strong. But these days, I think I saw the statistic that only 43% of people in Australia feel they have a link to the land. So, and that's through family connections. So yeah. In the past, every family, even though they lived in the city, had a connection to the land. Mm-hmm. Now that's dropping. And I think that's one of the great challenges of modern society, is how to connect people back to the land, back to the soil. And that's one of the things that I work on. trying to do that. And of course, that can be done in many different ways. You know, obviously education, but it can be done by the sort of stuff that you're doing through the arts, through exhibitions, through graphic, all kinds of art, but also I think even through food. You know, the idea that having this idea of food provenance. Where is the food? Where does the food that you eat come from? What kind of soil is it grown in? And I think that link is something that we will strengthen over time. And so one of the things I actually work on is to try and come up with a technological solution to how can we figure out where that bit of food that you're eating what kind of soil does it come from? And that requires being able to trace that food through supply chains to the consumer, but the consumer should know exactly on what side of the hill, in what little field, in what little parish, in what little county that food was grown. And I think that once we have that re-established, we'll have that connectivity back to between people and the producer and the land. And that's kind of what's missing in modern society at the moment in terms of food. And because of that, I think people are, as you alluded to, less aware about soil than they are about many other things. Children get excited by rockets and dinosaurs, but not by soil, I think. But they love playing in soil.
They actually do get pretty excited by soil if you get them around it, you know?
Yeah. Yes.
They're just not around it very much. They're around pavement and they're around sand. And one of the best things about doing the project with soil that we did as the Caldor project in 2019 was that kids would run in there and just start running around. And I took that as a great compliment because Dan Graham, who's a great American artist, who's a kind of a mentor to me, once told me that if kids like a piece, it's a good piece. So I'm very happy with that. But I think something you just said also really resonated with me, which is to connect people to the land, to connect people to where things come from, their food. It feels to me like I read recently that the 20th century was the century of disenchantment, and that the job in the 21st century is to kind of re-enchant the world. And it strikes me that one of the things that would happen if people had a picture of the field on the side of the hill in the farm where a particular vegetable that they're eating came from, that would re-enchant these links.
Absolutely. And so you use the word enchantment. I think it's got more dimensions to it than just the connectivity that I'm talking about, because it obviously has an air of awe and spirituality about it as well. But I think we need to start at least with the connection through food. Seems to me the most direct connection that we can make. And then once we build that connection back, then we can start educating people about the soil. And then I think the spiritual link, which there is no doubt about that there is a spiritual link to soil. Some of the great, many religions, many cultures have this spiritual link, and there's an interesting thing in this spiritualism about soil. Is it neutral or is it male or female? In many cultures, we talk about Mother Earth, and in other cultures we talk about the fatherland, so or the motherland. So it's an interesting one, but there's no doubt that there is a link, an intrinsic link in within everyone back to soil and land. I feel it very strongly. Of course, I was brought up on a farm. I know what the soil is. I'm interested to know in general conversation to the audience out there whether those who are brought up in more urban environments have this feeling at all, or whether it's something that they need to develop over time.
Well, it's interesting because I'm unlike you. I grew up in a suburb of Buffalo, New York, and I was not around a lot of farm fields and a lot of things like that. But I remember when I was a kid taking the bus, and my bus would go by this golf course, and at that golf course, you would see a long distance across green to some
Yeah.
buildings off in the distance. And just at a young age, that view spoke to me very highly, even though it was a golf course. But just seeing land and off into the distance, and then buildings in the distance. So I think there's something to what you're saying, and I would have resisted this, by the way, Alex, 10 years ago, the idea that there's some intrinsic link between people and the land. But I actually now think that there probably is. I agree with you. However, you, like a lot of soil scientists I've met who have a passionate connection to soil and to the land, also had it growing up. And I was interested to find out when I started working with soil scientists, how many of you guys grew up on a farm?
Yeah, and I guess, well, I teach here in Sydney. Sydney's a large urban environment, so we teach. So the kind of students I teach, which are mainly doing agriculture, it's about 50-50. 50% of those kids have never been to a farm or haven't been brought up on a farm, but they still have this love of soil and working with soil. So it seems to be intrinsic there. So I think it is intrinsic in our humanity in some way. Obviously, coming back from millennia ago, when we were all down and dirty, getting into the soil and interacting with it all the time. So it's in there, in our, like many other things that are intrinsic to us, I think.
Yeah, that brings me to your work, because I find it interesting that when I first started reading about your work, which has to do a lot with digital technology and finding ways to look at soil from a point of view that allows us to discover more about its internal structure, to understand it, it felt very much like Western science to me, like you're using a microscope to peer inside something. But whenever I talk to you, I feel much more like I'm talking to someone who has a much more emotional, even poetic. I know you also write poetry, and you're yourself also an artist. I've seen some of your paintings. You yourself have a much more emotional / poetic kind of connection to it. So that's an interesting distinction to me, because am I wrong to say that your work is highly technological?
It's certainly more of the yes, more Western science-based approach. I think it's based on classical physics, I would say, my work. I'm Scottish. We value science and classical science very greatly, and I think that's the basis for our work. Quite a rational approach. Some people would say rather microscopic approach rather than a holistic approach. But I'm not sure about that. I think to do the whole holistic approach, you have to do the microscopic approach first, so that you can see what the bits and pieces are. Some statement that's a whole statement without knowing about the bits and pieces, I think probably has flaws to it. So that's kind of where I come from. Now, so the kind of work why do I do the kind of work I do? I'm worried about the world soil, that we might lose it as a part of nature. It has huge diversity. We're always talking about biodiversity, but there is a pedodiversity, and pedo comes from the Greek word meaning the ground. It's not the Latin word meaning children. It's the Greek word meaning the ground. Pedodiversity, and so there's all kinds of soil over the world. All millions of different kinds of soils, if you like, which is great. It's great. That diversity makes it safer for itself. The problem with that is if you want to know what's there, that means there's a lot of work to do, because it's everywhere and it's got very complex patterns to it. So we have to devise smart ways of actually trying to unravel that pattern and describe that pattern. And that's really what my work's about, how to efficiently unravel and describe that pattern. And by efficiently, I mean without having to dig up everywhere and without it costing billions and billions of dollars. But I mean, we probably have spent as a global community $50 billion trying to figure out what the soil is like already, and we've got and we know a bit about it. We'll have to do a bit more. So you know, it's a big challenge, but it's hugely interesting, and so we do get into you know, using satellites and remote sensing and using data science and big data and all of this stuff that's the fashion at the moment. But with one caveat from my point of view, there's no point in building models. If you build a model of the soil using machine learning, but you can't interpret the model, in other words, it's only a machine learned model, but as a human, I can't interpret it, then I think we're kind of lost. Our science is kind of lost there. So we need to be able to interpret the models that we build with any of these technologies. So it's an interesting point. What happens to human scientists when we get to the point where we can't interpret those models, but people still believe that they're predictable and useful. What is the role of the human scientist then? Anyway, I didn't mean to get off into this philosophical point, but
interesting existential point for the soil scientist. But let's
for all scientists, I think, but particularly for us soil scientists. So I'm very much seen as, although I've pioneered this area, I am now becoming the old conservative, because I'm not willing to accept that all models are equally good, even though they're predictive. If I can't interpret them, then I'm wondering what we actually have. And to go back to another point about being emotional, as a scientist, probably that hasn't helped me as a scientist. Because when I go to conferences and meetings and talk, people will think I'm too emotional.
Right.
And they would prefer a less emotional person to explain the science to them, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe
it's
that's
an interesting one. It was an interesting observation.
Yeah, but I think that's another thing about let's say the 20th century introduced a very serious split between a rationality and modern, like kind of modernist rationality, and then the emotions and affect. And now that split is maybe coming back together. So I see you as someone who fits more into our moment. But anyway, I wanted to ask you a serious question, which is relevant to people watching, which is, where are we right now? What's the state of the soil of this planet? Because as we know, it's not a renewable resource. It takes tens of thousands of years to build up. So how bad is it, or how good is it?
Yeah. So the simple answer and the answer that gains great note and empathy is to say, we're at a tipping point, and if we don't do something, we're going to lose it all. But I'm not that kind of person. I don't believe in the science or politics of fear. I'm a very optimistic person. So I think we've run down the soil for sure. I think one of the simpler ones to say, where we've been doing a lot of cropping, growing crops, we've probably lost half the carbon out of the soil. And people don't realize when we talk about carbon and global warming, most of the terrestrial carbon is in the soil, not in the vegetation above the soil, but actually in the soil. So that it's a very important reservoir for carbon. We've lost about half of it by cultivation. So, but for the last 40 years, we've been trying to reverse that trend, and I think we're on the way back to improving our soils again. And obviously, as science advances, as ecological science advances, and all the information we have about the world. So now we can map out the situation everywhere in the world reasonably well. We know where the problems are. So I would say we're on the way back. The question is, can we get there quick enough? Now, if it gets warmer quicker than we can recover it, then we do have a problem. But it is a race against time, because as the temperature rises, you lose more carbon. As you lose more carbon from the soil, it causes the temperature to rise. So there's a feedback there, and what we need to do is to reverse that, to put more carbon back into the soil, which we're trying to do, and then with all the other mitigation things, we can start building it back. So I would say we know more about the soil, obviously, than we did. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years, at least where everything is. Da Vinci said 500 years ago that we know more about the planets than we do about the soil beneath our feet. And unfortunately, that might still be true.
Mm.
In other words, we know a lot about cosmology and astronomy and so on, and relatively speaking, probably less about the soil. But we do more. Know more.
Really
we are on the way back.
Because I've been to your lab. I've looked at all the soil core samples from all over the world that you have that are really beautiful, where you get to see the structure of different kinds of soils. To me, it looks like you've generated your field, and you in your field have generated an awful lot of knowledge. So tell me what it means to say that we still don't know anything about soil.
Well, this might be the statement from any scientist. It's peeling the onion. It's the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But the simplest question, I would say, that we don't know how to put that carbon back very quickly or very efficiently. If we could do that, we could solve this global warming problem very quickly. But we can put it back, but at the soil's own pace. We haven't figured out how to do it quicker than that, and that's something we need to try to figure out. So there's a bit of chemistry, and largely chemistry, biochemistry, that we need to figure out that will allow us to put that carbon back. And that's just one example of many things we don't know. But that I would say at the moment that's the most important one. But we will figure that out. I'm very confident about science. That we will figure things out. I mean, look at this year, and the fact that we probably now will be able to have a vaccination for the COVID. So science worked very quickly, and if there are huge problems, science works quickly, and it is goal oriented, tries to come up with solutions. So I'm positive, always.
I like that you've emphasized that you're an optimist, and I already knew that about you, but you've also given a sense of the gravity of the situation, because I hear you when you're saying, it's a race against time. That's a serious thing to say. That means that the quality of the world's soil is already depleted considerably if it's already a race against time to just make sure we don't lose
yeah,
it.
it is. I mean, it has depleted compared with, let's say, 100 years ago. But remember, you know, what we're asking the soil to feed 7 or 8 billion people, and going up to 10, as opposed to 2 billion people. And that's where that's the extra burden we put on the soil. 97% of all the food that you eat comes via the soil. You know, and we talk about, and this is a question that I asked my colleagues. Here's a question. I asked my colleagues this question in a conference last year in Texas. How many people in the audience think that soil will be an important part of food production in 100 years? And I think most of them put their hand up. These are soil scientists. I'm not so sure. And I think it might be better for the soil if the answer was it'll play a much smaller part, because that would give the chance for the soil to recover, the planet to recover.
So you're talking hydroponics or other ways of...
I'm talking about, yeah, growing systems that don't necessarily use soil now. But you have to realize, and this is where you have to realize how much area or how much energy it might take to actually transform our agricultural production system based on soil into some other system that didn't use soil and didn't use all the land area. And I mean, and we hear a lot about these days about urban growth spaces, but the scale, you have to imagine what scale you'd need to do this. But I'm also of the opinion that we should at least try and do some of that, so that we can rest up some of the soil that had the most pressure put on it over time, so that it can recover. Because I think, like you said, in the next century, provided we're sensible about this, we have the opportunity to rebuild the planetary systems that we've dismantled to some degree. We can rebuild those and still maintain an economy and a life on planet Earth. I think we can do all of those things if we're very sensible about how we proceed. So as I said, I'm very optimistic about all of that.
What I think is very intriguing about what we've been, your account of the situation in the world right now is the sheer impact of the 7 or 8 billion human beings, their need to eat, their need to have space, their need to, have sewage, like the sheer impact of the sheer number of bodies, of pounds or kilograms of human body living on the planet is actually massive. And that's something that we're very much not used to thinking about in terms of the relationship between humans and the whole biosphere. But it comes out very clear when you talk about the situation.
Yeah, well, of course, most of that population now, for the last 5 years, more than 50% of it are urbanized. And so they're divorced away from where most of the food and soil is used. But I'm still, I mean, we see this huge impact, but I'm also of the mind that all of that can be made more efficient. In other words, we can reduce that impact considerably and still maintain a population. Be nice if the population plateaued out or started to decrease slightly, or just, let's say, plateaued out. We can feed all these people, but by making our agriculture more efficient, less impactful, and I said over time, building some alternative systems that will take the pressure off some of the land, to allow it to recover, and then over time we can recycle, where we can move around the recovery areas, if you like. And so I'm confident that we can maintain that population and reduce impact and make the whole thing quite sustainable. I don't think it's a runaway express train if we don't want it to be.
Do you feel that the imperative of economic growth is in conflict with this idea that with what you're talking about? I always ask economists that question. They never answer, of course. Do we always have to have growth? I mean, that's how you measure whether the country's going okay. It grew 1% compared with last year, and so you imagine that if you want to grow, you need resources. But the question is, can you? I guess there is something called the weightless economy or the invisible economy, which is the economy that's made by information, not by material. And if we can grow economies by information and not by material, then I think the planet is sustainable. So economic growth that occurs due to the growth of value in immaterial terms.
Yeah, yes, and that's why the work that I do is about creating information about soil that allows people to make better decisions about soil, and they can use it more efficiently, or use it more efficiently, more sustainably. And so I think there is a weightless economy that we can grow for everybody that doesn't require materials, except huge computer farms that need lots of energy, but hopefully it's sustainable energy.
But you're optimistic. You're an optimistic.
Yeah, I'm absolutely optimistic. Yes, absolutely.
Get some photos from Alex's office and his lab.
That's one of my pictures there, actually, the one below.
No,
Pull up.
we see the chair now.
Oh, you see the chair. Sorry, I can't. Let me see what. Let me see what you can. That one.
Oh, it's beautiful.
That one, the red
Yeah,
one.
the long one, no?
Yeah, that's one of mine.
Wow.
That's a soil. I can't. I'm not very good on. That's why. And these are the soil pictures. That's what I meant to show you.
Oh my goodness.
They're
So
stunning.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Is that the depth of the soil? So as you go down?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And that's what people don't realize. I think that the one thing that people don't realize, that it's not just this little few inches, few centimeters at the top, but it's got a very distinctive pattern and coloration and sequence, and it's something quite beautiful. And so I think if you're doing an installation, you need to make one that's got some layering in it, Assad, so that they can
Dad,
discover
take note.
the layers.
I listen to everything that this man says. It's all being
Bit of
followed.
bit of layering is good.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
The deeper, I want to make a real deep, it's to me, the deeper you can do it, the better, because when you're walking around inside and the doors are too low and you're running into stuff, that's also great. So anyway, we'll work on it.
When the soil fills it up and you can't get your head through the door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that.